Between 1960 and 2000, the greatest city in India had turned into a battlefield. Gang wars, police encounters, shootouts, and revenge killings dominated the headlines, even as the streets of Bombay simmered with clandestine criminal activities. Gold from Dubai smuggled in on aeroplanes and container ships, and secret drug deals that moved enough product that it could have been a company listed on the Bombay Stock Exchange. At the peak of the mafia's power, Mumbai was the sort of place even a policeman would ask for permission before entering a gang-controlled territory. There was an energy in the city, an energy that burned bright with the glamour of Bollywood, fueled by a never-ending supply of alcohol and drugs, and kept afloat by an equally infinite supply of black money. Because at the heart of it, that's what it was all about: money and power. Mumbai was a city that swallowed and chewed up everyone and everything, where you could be world famous one day and utterly forgotten the next. The only way to survive was to rise to the top, trampling enemies and friends alike, leaving behind a trail of your own misdeeds. This video is part 1 of 2, where I tell you the story of how the Underworld came to dominate the streets of Mumbai, had Bollywood and the Mumbai police in its stranglehold, and just 3 men ran the biggest and most brilliantly organized crime syndicate India has ever seen. That is, until one young upstart decided that the fastest way to the top of the food chain is to eliminate everyone in his path. This is the terrible true story of the Mumbai Mafia. It wasn't always like this. I mean, the streets of Bombay had never been safe at night, even in the 1930s and 40s. The city was growing fast, too fast, swelling with people from the poorest corners of the country who came in search of a livelihood. The lucky ones got employment, but many did not. And if there's a stronger motive to drive someone towards a life of crime than the promise of great riches, it's the certainty of poverty and starvation. Desperate youngsters from Allahabad, Kanpur and Jaunpur roamed the city, armed with knives and machetes, searching for unsuspecting citizens to relieve them of their possessions. But petty robbery is a low-stakes game. You might occasionally come across an expensive watch or a decent amount of cash, but there's no way you can make any real money from it. In those early days, crime was disorganized and gangsters were just two-bit criminals who operated in the city streets. But the first signs of an underworld were beginning to take shape as a bunch of violent immigrant men, mostly from UP, banded together in small gangs and fought for territory in Baikalla. They carried around these stylized switchblades with them, which came to be known as the Rampuri Chaku, hiding it away in their pockets and whipping it out when they needed to threaten citizens or fight a rival gang member. In a country where guns were expensive and very hard to come by, the Rampuri Chaku became the unofficial symbol of rising gang violence in Bombay. But as these first gangs fought their petty wars on the streets, a young man from a small village in Tamil Nadu began his first day of work as a coolie in the Bombay docks. As one of the biggest ports in India, the docks were one of the busiest places in the city and always in need of fresh labor to move the hundreds of tons of cargo that arrived every day from around the world. Mastan Haidar Mirza was just 8 when he moved to Bombay with his father to seek better opportunities in the big city. He'd worked at his father's bicycle repair shop for 10 years before he realized this was getting him nowhere in life. Now that he was 18 and strong enough to carry heavy loads, he could make some decent money as a dock worker. By the time India gained independence in 1947, he'd already been working at the Bombay docks for 3 years and knew his way around the complex maze of dockyards, customs offices, and cargo terminals. While the rest of the young coolies were content to just go about their work and scrape together a living, Mastan was becoming keenly aware of how business operated in the port, especially in the customs office. The British used to impose hefty import duties on goods arriving from abroad, and these continued even after independence. If he could somehow bypass the customs officials, merchants would be more than willing to pay him a small cut for his trouble. Mastan's father had always taught him to be sincere in his work and earn an honest living. But in this case, the customs duties were a relic of the British era, an unfair imposition on Indians. So naturally, there was nothing immoral about evading import duties, right? It was at this time that Mastan met a man named Ghalib, who also worked at the docks and needed a coolie's help to pull off a smuggling operation. Now, to be perfectly clear, this was still a really small-time activity. Mastan would stuff a few gold biscuits in his headband, some luxury watches in his underwear, or some transistors in his turban. Hardly the sort of thing that would make headlines. It did mean that he went from earning 15 rupees a month to a much more respectable 50 rupees. But a coolie is still a coolie, and he wanted more. The city of Bombay was unfolding before him, skyscrapers rising higher, cars becoming more luxurious, houses and apartments growing more lavish. He was tired of the riches of India's wealthiest city passing him by as he stood watching from the sidelines. But as fate would have it, a fearsome gunda named Sher Khan Pathan had been terrorizing the Mazgaon docks for months, extorting payments from dock workers and beating up anyone who refused. If this sounds like an oversized school bully who beats up smaller kids to steal their lunch money, that's exactly what Sher Khan was. He came from a community of Pathans who had migrated to Bombay from Afghanistan, and you'd be hard-pressed not to notice them in a crowd. Tall, fair and muscular, these Pathan men were often hired as recovery agents by moneylenders and feared by everyone in Bombay. Much like his colleagues, Mastan was thoroughly fed up with the Pathans' behavior and decided to take matters into his own hands. Organizing a group of 10 dock workers armed with lathis, Mastan took the Pathan gang by surprise, beating them to a pulp and sending them packing. After being so badly humiliated, Sher Khan would never return to trouble the Bombay dock workers again. With that one act of justice, Mastan became the talk of the entire port, a hero of the coolies. Without knowing, he had earned a loyal force of dock workers ready to do his bidding, and suddenly Mastan realized the small smuggling operation he was running didn't need to be so small anymore. The career of Varadarajan Mudaliar began in much the same way as that of Mastan. He worked as a coolie in Bombay's Victoria Terminus train station. And just like Mastan, the young man from Tamil Nadu had ambitions far above his current job moving suitcases and cargo. But what is a penniless, illiterate immigrant living off a daily wage supposed to do? Varadarajan, or Varada as he was called, found his answer in the very cargo he was supposed to transport. Early in his career, he was running a risky but profitable side hustle, stealing items from railway cargo boxes. Unlike Mastan, Varada's moral code was rather more lenient on the subject of crime. As long as you didn't get caught, what difference is a few missing cargo boxes going to make? But then, something incredible happened. Bombay state, which comprised present-day Gujarat and Maharashtra, enacted alcohol prohibition across the state. Now, if you've read about prohibition in the US between 1920 and 1933, that famously did not work out. In fact, the ban on alcohol actually spawned many of the most powerful gangs that ruled over cities like Chicago and New York in those days. Clearly, the Bombay government had not paid attention to history because when they made alcohol illegal in 1948, no one was more ready to take advantage of the situation than good old Varada Bhai. Illegal booze flooded the streets of Bombay and bootlegging became a wildly lucrative business. Varada was a smooth talker and shrewd businessman, capable of wriggling out of high-stress encounters with the police while moving thousands of liters of hooch to secret bars and liquor shops around Dharavi and Koliwada. The illegal liquor industry was low budget but ingenious. The maze-like slums in Dharavi were hiding nondescript huts where alcohol was being produced with basic distilling equipment. They then filled the tubes of old truck tires with the booze, stacked them on the roadsides at night, and then loaded them into carrier vehicles. Ironically, many of the transporters moving this booze from the distillery to the various bars in the city were retired or suspended policemen who saw it as an easy way to make some extra money. Now, it's not like the police were stupid. They could tell if a vehicle was transporting contraband. Usually, it would be a normal-looking car that was suspiciously missing the back seats for more storage space. They'd be stationed at key locations that the bootleggers called garam sections, so the transporters had an escort vehicle. As they approached the police, the escort car would stop and block the police vehicle, conveniently having some kind of ignition failure, which would give the carrier vehicle enough time to escape. Varda was wickedly smart at planning and executing these high-stakes operations and started making some serious money from bootlegging. And unlike many other bootleggers in Dharavi, Varda reinvested his money in various businesses. And before long, he'd gone from a fairly low-level criminal to running several illegal enterprises and managing a formidable force of slum-dwelling youths, most of them Tamilians like him. But what made Varda so beloved in Dharavi was his fondness for community. He'd always liked doing charity through a local dargah, offering food to poor devotees. His success in the bootlegging business allowed him to be even more generous to the people of Bombay's slums, and he was really earning a reputation for being the guy you could go to if you're in trouble. The role of Mafia Don really seemed to suit Varda Bhai. People from all over Dharavi used to come to him to solve their problems, whether it was getting them illegal electricity, water supply, ration cards, or even protection from rival gangsters. Tamilians had heard of Varda all the way back in their small towns and villages in Tamil Nadu, and they came to Bombay knowing they could count on Varda to help them get set up in the big city. He'd even hold a sort of informal court where people came to him with their disputes and he'd resolve them based on his unofficial set of laws. The Don's network seemed to penetrate every inch of the city, from the police to government officials to businesses, and he managed everything with a savvy commercial sense. He made sure to divide his business into distinct areas, ensuring no one encroached on each other's territory and got into unnecessary conflict. Any police constable stationed near a bar that was selling his illegal liquor was paid a handsome 5,000 rupees to look the other way, while the booze was sold at 10 rupees per glass. At his height, Varda was making over 12 crores a year selling liquor, and that was in the 1960s. All that money meant he could diversify his business into gambling, protection rackets, and prostitution. Young girls from the poorest parts of Karnataka and Tamil Nadu were lured to Bombay with the promise of money and employment. The sex trade in Dharavi was mostly run by eunuchs who would convince these girls to sell their bodies, and if they refused, would force them to do it. If the people receiving Varadarajan's charity knew about his many ugly side businesses, they certainly didn't speak out about it, because anyone who did wasn't likely to wake up the next morning. Imagine you're a landlord in 1950s Bombay and you want to increase the rent on your apartments, but one of your tenants is refusing to pay. He's being a real pain and won't leave even after you send him multiple reminders. The police aren't doing anything, and it's not like you can go and forcefully kick someone out of the building. Then one day, you overhear someone talking about some Pathan fellow. Apparently, he specializes in persuading uncooperative tenants to vacate their apartments. Maybe you should give him a call. The next day, a huge mountain of a man arrives at your doorstep and introduces himself as Abdul Karim Khan. He's nearly 7 feet tall, is built like an ox, and his handshake almost takes you off your feet. You tell him which apartment you need help with, and he quietly heads up the stairs. You hear a door crash open, someone screaming, things being thrown across the room, and muffled cries that sound like someone being punched in the face. A few moments later, Karim Khan comes down the stairs, looking as though absolutely nothing has happened. He tells you your tenant has already started packing up and will be gone before lunch. Before he came here, you thought about haggling down his fee, but now you think the better of it and just give him what he asked for. And just like that, he's gone. You just met one of Bombay's most feared gangsters, an Afghani Pathan who came to be known as Karim Lala. As brutish as he looked, Karim Lala had actually earned a reputation for being a fair and honest moneylender. It's just that for a man like him, recovering that money wasn't really an issue. Over the years, Lala had established several illegal gambling dens in the city and became the leader of a gang of Pathans. But the thing he was really known for was evicting problematic tenants from buildings. It got to the point where tenants would just evict themselves if the landlord so much as mentioned Lala's name. Later in life, he started carrying a walking stick that became sort of his unofficial symbol, and landlords paid him a reduced amount just to keep his stick in front of the tenant's front door. When the tenants saw the stick, they'd immediately understand and pack up their things. The man had an aura about him, and he commanded as much fear as he did respect. People would come to him to settle their disputes, lining up on the terrace of the Don's building every Sunday to air their grievances. But even the most fearsome mafia don has to have friends in high places, and Karim Lala made sure to keep everyone from politicians to police officials on his payroll. It didn't matter how high up or well respected they were. The moment the Pathan chief waved a wad of banknotes at them, they would be willing to dance to any tune he pleased. There was just one man that Lala was never able to bribe. He was a head constable with the Bombay police, a strong, self-respecting man that refused to grovel before the Bombay mafiosi. Maybe that's why Karim Lala respected him so much. Over the years, they'd formed a sort of strained friendship, one where the police officer kept trying to persuade the gangster to give up his illicit dealings. That man's name was Ibrahim Kaskar, father of a young boy named Dawood Ibrahim Kaskar. By the way, this is just part 1 of my Mumbai Mafia series. In part 2, I'll be exploring the rise of modern gangsters. Dawood Ibrahim, Chota Rajan, Arun Gavli. So if you want to see that video and support my channel, please like this video, get subscribed and hit the bell icon so you don't miss part 2 when it comes out. Now back to the video. In the years after he'd beaten Sher Khan Pathan and earned the loyalty of his fellow dock workers, Mastan fully abandoned his old job as a coolie and devoted himself completely to the smuggling business. His old friend Ghalib had proved to be invaluable, traveling to Dubai, Africa and Hong Kong to strike deals with local merchants who sold him gold, luxury watches and electronics that Mastan ingeniously smuggled into the city. He even struck a deal with Sukur Narayan Bakhia, the largest smuggler in Gujarat, to source shipments coming through the Daman port. As lucrative as selling illegal booze or evicting tenants can be, the real money in those days was in smuggling, and Mastan was a very good smuggler. Unlike most other mafia dons, Mastan wasn't the type to resort to violence or dirty his hands with unsavory business practices. He was refined, a real gentleman, dealing with gold and silver biscuits, not gambling dens and brothels. He wore expensive bespoke suits, spoke in refined Urdu, and built a palatial home in the snooty Malabar Hills, not in places like Dharavi or Dongri. If you asked him, he might have said he's not a mafia don at all, just a businessman. Mastan was very well aware of the fact that in the cutthroat underworld of Bombay, this was a weakness. He had a shrewd mind for business, but no muscle to back it up. He had the money to deal with politicians or the police, but if some gangster decided to cause some trouble for him, he had no way to hit back. He needed the help of someone with serious manpower, someone who had connections at the street level and could get things done. He'd heard of a man named Varadarajan in Dharavi, a Tamilian like him, and was trying to figure out how to approach him. That's when Mastan had a stroke of luck. He'd heard that Varada had been arrested for stealing antennae from the Bombay docks. Normally, this isn't the sort of thing that police would have bothered with, but to Varada's bad luck, those antennae were being imported for a major politician in the Union Ministry. As Varada sat in jail to await questioning, Mastan made a deal with the police. If they let Varada go, he'd find and return their antennae. Most of the cops were already friendly with Mastan, being on his payroll for his smuggling business, so they agreed. Mastan then went up to Varada's cell and said, "Vanakkam, Talaivar." Hearing Bombay's wealthiest smuggler acknowledge him as an equal, and in Tamil no less, must have shocked Varada because that got his attention. The cops had no idea what they were discussing in hushed tones, because if they did, they surely would have put a stop to it. This was the moment that two of Bombay's biggest mafia dons would forge an alliance. One where a smooth-talking Dharavi gangster would provide manpower and street-level know-how to a millionaire smuggler dealing with gold and merchants from as far afield as Dubai and Africa. And before long, Mastan would also manage to shake hands with the head of the Pathans, Karim Lala, creating an unholy trifecta of crime bosses who practically ran the city of Bombay in the 1960s and 70s. They would make obscene amounts of money, have the citizens and government of Bombay in their pockets, and anyone who stood in their way would find that they didn't have long before someone came knocking at their door. Varada wasted no time in exploiting his new alliance with Mastan. While he couldn't get into the smuggling business himself, he realized that the next best option was simply to steal cargo from the Bombay docks and pass it off as smuggled goods in the black market. It's not like the buyer cared as long as they got a fair price. Varada would use his contacts from his days as a porter to get several Tamil workers hired in the docks, who then followed his orders to set aside certain valuable shipments in hidden storage areas and simply mark them as missing goods. If the Bombay port authorities came sniffing around, a few smooth words and rolls of cash would be enough to keep them quiet, and Varada would make off with lakhs worth of merchandise every week. He'd not forgotten his roots either. Every year during Ganesh Chaturthi, Varada would organize Bombay's most expensive and lavish Ganesha Pandal right in front of the busy Matunga railway station. A public invitation for all the citizens of Bombay to celebrate, and an even more public challenge to the city authorities. It's well known that many of the top Bollywood movie stars used to make an appearance at his pandals. It was so brazen that he would hire entire teams of police constables to block off multiple roads and guard the pandal. I mean, you have to give it to him. The balls on this guy. Meanwhile, Mastan was branching out in his own right. With all that money he'd made in the smuggling business, he wanted to create something that would leave a lasting legacy. And in the city of Bombay, the answer was a no-brainer. Bollywood. Back in those days, banks operating in India were tightly controlled by the RBI, and according to them, the business of filmmaking wasn't classified as an industry as it was too financially unstable. This meant that even the biggest Bollywood studios and producers were considered ineligible to take out loans to finance movie production. So who did Bollywood filmmakers turn to when they needed money? Pretty much anyone who had enough of it. Private businessmen and merchants, even the ones who didn't strictly follow the letter of the law. Mastan had always been a fan of Bollywood films and was smitten by the starlets who sang and danced on the silver screen. The movie business was just too tempting to ignore. He could launder all his black money by investing it in a legitimate enterprise. The producers got the funding they needed to make ever more elaborate and expensive productions. And best of all, Mastan got an excuse to hobnob with the elite crowd of Bombay, rubbing shoulders with famous Bollywood stars. I mean, this is a guy who had such a big crush on Madhubala as a young boy that when he found a young actress called Veena Sharma who looked just like her, he immediately asked her to marry him. Things were looking really good for the crime bosses of Bombay. The alliance between the three biggest dons meant that there were fewer violent gang wars, less attention from the police, and business flowed freely. They were smuggling crores worth of merchandise into the city every month, running gambling houses, brothels, drug trafficking, illegal construction, protection rackets. This was proper organized crime, a far cry from the petty burglary and extortion Bombay used to be known for a couple of days ago. The Underworld owned the streets of Bombay, and for a while, it seemed like they were too big and powerful to be touched. And then, India declared an emergency. None of the Mafia dons could have predicted what happened in 1975. The Bombay Mafia weren't just a threat to the security of Indian citizens, they were actively damaging the country's economy through illegal smuggling. The previous year, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi had amended the Maintenance of Internal Security Act to allow the government to arrest people without producing charges before a court of law. This meant that the Bombay police didn't need to have ironclad evidence in order to incarcerate mafia gangsters. Mastan was among the first to be taken in. As the most flamboyant don, he was an easy target and spent 90 days in jail in 1974. When it seemed like he might be let out, the government brought fresh charges against him under the Conservation of Foreign Exchange and Prevention of Smuggling Act, or the COFE POSA. Rolls right off the tongue. When Indira Gandhi imposed an emergency in 1975, the government was freely able to detain Bombay's crime bosses as long as they liked. Despite hiring Ram Jethmalani, one of India's top lawyers, to represent him in court, Mastan languished the entire 19-month period of the emergency in jail. If it was any consolation, he wasn't alone. Pretty much every major gangster in Bombay, Varadarajan Mudaliar, Karim Lala, Dawood Ibrahim, the entire Pathan gang and Arun Gawli were all put behind bars with little opportunity to appeal their case. Jails all the way from Bombay to Pune to Kolhapur were at maximum capacity from the intense crackdown on organized crime between 1975 and 77. The emergency was the beginning of the end for Bombay's big three dons. After being at the top of Bombay's underworld for nearly 2 decades, the experience of spending a year and a half in jail left Mastan and the aging Karim Lala thoroughly shaken. They weren't keen on inviting that kind of trouble from the government again. Going forward, the old dons maintained a more subdued presence in underworld activity and spent their time in other pursuits. Mastan became deeply religious, completing the Hajj journey to Mecca and thereafter being known as Haji Mastan. He donated lakhs of rupees to charity, and people used to line up in front of his house to receive food. He even tried his hand at politics, but that didn't really go anywhere. In the case of Karim Lala, his Pathan gang was weakened after Dawood Ibrahim decided to form his own gang, D Company. But that story I'll be covering in part 2 of this series. Of the 3 original dons, only Varda continued to exercise any real influence in the underworld. The massive community of Tamilians in Bombay was growing every single day, and he was still their undisputed king, the man who could solve all their problems. But by the early 1980s, even Varada's famous Ganesha pandals began receiving eviction notices from the government, and the police began cracking down hard on his illegal gambling dens and liquor shops. The man behind this bold new mission was the Deputy Commissioner Y.C. Pawar, who refused to let Varadarajan reclaim the influence he enjoyed in the 60s and 70s. One of Pawar's most innovative strategies was to have a new police chowk built exactly in the area where Varda installed his Ganesha Pandal in Matunga, forcing the Don to drastically reduce the size of his once palatial pandals. Eventually, the pressure became too great and Varda decided to beat a hasty retreat back to Tamil Nadu, where he'd spend the rest of his days. And just like that, the 3 greatest mafia dons of Bombay had either faded into obscurity or fled the city. But as I'm sure you've guessed, this is far from the end of the Mumbai underworld story. In fact, some of Mumbai's darkest years were when it was controlled by an even more ruthless, even more bloodthirsty cabal of gangsters. A new breed of criminal who weren't afraid of getting into shootouts with police, committing daring assassinations inside courtrooms, and murdering people in broad daylight. Not to mention a terrorist attack that killed hundreds of innocents and brought a city of millions to a complete standstill. There's much more to the story of the Mumbai Mafia, one where the strings were pulled by a young up-and-coming gangster named Dawood Ibrahim. If you don't want to miss that next chapter of the story, make sure to subscribe to my channel and drop a comment below sharing what open secrets you've heard about the organized crime syndicates that used to run India's richest city. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Anish Bhargav and I'll see you in the next one.